Hi ladies, we're going to talk a little bit about the filter and filter options on Photoshop and then how to blend different layers because we're going to use these tools a little bit in a watercolor tutorial that we're going to do. So before we do that tutorial, it's good just to play around with these features. I'm going to show you how some of them work on a couple random photographs from online, and then what you ladies can do is take some of your homework photos, if any of them you think would work. Or, also you can just Google some photos online. I wouldn't spend too much time searching for the perfect photograph, though, just to play around with these options, because that can just take a little bit too long. So I'll show you a couple things to do, and then I want you guys to try and replicate it on your own. The first one we're going to do is talk about a really common background blur that a lot of photos do to just kind of really accentuate the subject of a photo. So we have this pretty basic photo here with a pretty complicated background. And what we can do is if we select, let's do this. So I already made a selection earlier. So if we have just these two ladies selected and the whole background, or they're actually not selected, this whole background rather is all selected. If we do that, what we can do to kind of minimize and blur out this background and go to filters, we can go to blur and we can pick Gaussian blur. That's the most common one. Now anytime you get an option to make a filter, you usually get a preview. The preview shows you how to zoom out or into an image. So that gives you a little more idea what's going to happen, and it also shows you the variety you can do with the blur. So that's a huge blur, too much, and that's not really enough of a difference. So let's maybe go up to 7. And okay. Now you get to see that they really stand out. So if I do Command D, it's a pretty dramatic difference between the original photo and this bottom photo. So that's one little option to play around with, but filters also has a lot of other options. So this little photograph of a forest, let's go back to filter and let's try, let's see, let's go to distort and pinch. That's kind of a fun one. You can see the level of the pinch here and you can change that scale. You can also, again, zoom in or out with these little options here. And let's hit OK, see what it looks like. Pretty fun effect that Photoshop can do with that one. Let's also see about the stylized ones are really fun. We can make it look like an oil painting. That gives you another little preview. And here a bunch of scales to pick from. That'll change how the image looks. But if you hit OK, it just takes a little while to load, but now you have what looked like a photograph, now it's going to look like almost digital artwork. Pretty fun. And the last thing I want to talk to you about, so again, those would be all different ones you could play around with, just see what they do, get a sense for how they behave and what your personal preferences are. And now if we go to this last example, so we have this very basic portrait, but if you wanted to add a little more dimension or texture to it, you can start thinking about how your layers are blended. So I have 3 layers here, but only the bottom is visible, right? And right now, these are all, let's go to this one. Normally, layers are just defaulted to this normal option. This is how they're blended, which is technically to say not at all. So let's get rid of that for a second. Normal and normal. So when they're at their normal, like their default blend mode, they don't actually blend together. You'd have to cut something out to see a layer below it. So if I want them to interact in a more interesting way or complicated way, let's make this one invisible for a second, then I can go to my top layer and I can change how it blends with all the layers below it. So for instance, I can choose to pick overlay. Now you see that it has this really interesting effect where she has a little more depth to her portrait, kind of a nice background texture happening. I can also try the lighten. little more subtle. And also these are groups, so these ones darken, these ones lighten, and so on. These ones all interact in different ways. Let's try multiply. Very dark. So one other way you can do it that we can also try, instead of this is like a watercolor texture, this one. But if I get rid of this layer of the watercolor texture, and if I go to my just plain watercolor paper, that's kind of what this image is. And now I can go down here, I can change my blend modes. Let's see what happens with screen. Pretty light, not super helpful. Maybe linear burn. A little bit better, gives her a little more texture to the background. But again, you can take these different blend modes, play around with them, see how they interact, and we're going to use these for our watercolor demonstration coming up. Okay, I would spend maybe like 10 minutes just playing around with these different blend modes and filters. And then once you've done that and you've played around with it, go move on to the watercolor tutorial.